Hey everybody, this is Mr. Baker again. Hope you're doing well. This is Baker's Backyard or Baker's Corner, and this is basically an installment. We're going to do about two lessons on the aftermath, if you will, of the Civil War. And you see it on your screen. It's called Reconstruction. So a lot of students, guys, like to ask the question, what is Reconstruction? What are we reconstructing? Well, I want you guys to think back to your knowledge from your study of the Civil War. And I don't know how your teachers do this, but I know if you're in my class, we do a little bit of discussion on battles and we do quite a bit of discussion on things along the lines of Lincoln and the way that the country is developing when he's, serving as president, the different challenges that he has. Okay. And so therefore, as a result, what are we really trying to reconstruct? Well, first of all, let's take a look at Lincoln's ideas. So one of your assignments was to look at the Gettysburg Address, break it down, think about, what is Lincoln getting at? And the date is important here for this reason, because this is about the middle part of the Civil War. So we're not even aware that we're going to have an ending point to this conflict. And I'm not going to read the entire document. Guys, if you think about it, the question to ask yourself is, how does this document perhaps give us a little bit of an idea about how Lincoln is going to kind of approach not just the rest of this war, but also how to kind of mend the nation's wounds, if you will, afterwards? Keep in mind one big thing. The Civil War ends at the surrender of Appomattox on April 9th. Problem is, Lincoln only survives that date by 5 days. Okay, but look at what he says. Any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So his ultimate goal, guys, is to try to transition the nation back, perhaps as peacefully as possible, but also beyond that, guys, in a way that is going to obviously try to mend some of the solid things that have happened as a result of the war. Remember, we're talking about a conflict that created and produced a lot of division, and it's very easy to focus on that before and during. But also, guys, think about it like this. When you have a lot of people that have varying ideas about how to kind of transition us back. Now, that could be people that are currently in our Congress. That could be the presidents. That could also be people that are in the Confederate States that are now having to reenter. It is not going to be an easy process. Okay. But think about what Lincoln is getting at here when he's talking about, at the end of this address, these 272 words, a new birth of freedom, right? So think about, guys, the real big thing that Lincoln's already done prior to even this address with his famous Emancipation Proclamation. He kind of starts the ball rolling toward eventually what we associate with the 13th Amendment, right? So there's no question that Lincoln, of course, is moving us in that direction in my mind. The question is, does that get really fulfilled as a result? All right. So when we're thinking about Reconstruction, one big kind of essential question, if you will, analyze. So not just memorize details, but also analyze, consider the significance, the long-term effects. Guys, think, the modern day, not to get too political on this, but we have some things that have developed that are really what I would call byproducts of some of the limitations of the outcomes of Reconstruction when it comes to the idea of fostering equality in the areas of social things, political, economic, etc. Okay, so we're going to be spending time in the next couple of sessions looking at political, economic, and social impacts on the nation, and also identify reasons why Reconstruction came to an end. I want to challenge the students to ask themselves the question, and this is not really one answer, but it's certainly your evaluation of evidence here, guys. Would you have considered Reconstruction to be a successful attempt to bring the country back into a state of togetherness? Okay, and I'm not going to tell you the answer to that, but what I will encourage you guys to do is to think about that, brainstorm it, and ask yourself, all these examples that we're going to talk about in the next few sessions, how do they either support that notion, refute the notion, meaning reject it, or maybe is there a little bit of in between, meaning were there some things that Reconstruction did effectively, whereas others maybe not so much? Okay, so something for us to keep, guys, in the back of our minds is when we're looking at a big picture, you can pause the screen if you want to do this warm up because we're going to be looking at it. But a lot of people, guys, ask the question, what is a good, using one of my former colleagues and friends' expression, what is a good working definition of the period of Reconstruction? Well, it's about a 12-year period, so it lasts about a dozen years. But this is a really good basic definition of what we're looking at. It's a period following the Civil War. So we're looking at, guys, transition from a 4-year period of warfare and certainly separation to one that the goal is to bring the country back together, where the former Confederate states are being brought back into the United States. Now, keep in mind, guys, in Lincoln's mind, even though he doesn't live to see Reconstruction through, he does start this process. And what's going to happen, guys, is that he does not have the opportunity, unfortunately, to see the process through. Okay, so something for us to keep in the back of our mind is that, can this be done peacefully? Right? Is that a realistic possibility? I don't know. What I do know is that there's 3 major problems, issues, dilemmas, if you will, that are actually facing the country, particularly the South, post-Civil War. Okay? So, economic. Guys, remember, the South really is not what we call a diverse economic area. It does not have a lot of industry. It does have quite a bit of agriculture. The problem is, guys, remember, the war-ravaged conditions are going to really limit things like cotton production, okay? And then also the infrastructure, okay? Guys, the question that a lot of students have is, okay, infrastructure, what exactly is that involving? Well, think about the earlier lessons when we talked about internal improvements, building things like roads, bridges, railroads, okay, canals, things like that, okay? Things that contribute to the economic well-being of a nation or even a region. Those are things that unfortunately are ravaged. And the question is, how do they get rebuilt? That's a good question. Why? Not everybody agrees on that. Should it be a collective effort by union people and also Southern governments? Not exactly easy. Secondly, you got to remember, guys, with the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, we have approximately 4 million, we're going to use the word freedmen, but basically former slaves, guys, that are now transitioning to a life of freedom. And that is obviously going to be a very important yet difficult transition, right? It has political implications. It has economic implications. It also has social implications, okay? One thing to keep in mind, and a lot of times it's very easy to overlook, is a lot of times we focus on the Civil War affecting the plantation owners, right? These people that own humongous farms with, in some cases, hundreds to maybe even, in some cases, thousands of slaves. That is true, but guys, we forget the people that were really affected too, kind of like your general poor, white farmers, okay? So how are those people going to return from war, okay, and have a challenge to be able to get back in the saddle, return to their lives, right, their families, etc.? And then maybe one of the more important things for us to consider is the political side. We're going to spend a lot of time here in a minute discussing that. But guys, ask yourself the question, what do you think should happen to former Southern or Confederate leaders? Should they be pardoned or should they be punished, right? Now, some of you might be familiar with the word pardon, which is fine. Okay, if you're not, that kind of means that you've, done something that's, maybe a crime or something along those lines. And it's almost like you're given a blank slate. Who pardons people or potentially can? It's the president. In the case of the federal government, guys, what does it mean to punish? Well, that's kind of the opposite, right? You're kind of throwing the book at people. You're limiting maybe their participation in government, their citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, think about it like this. If you're trying to make a country that is maybe somewhat more united, that's been separated, the question would be, okay, well, why not be more conciliatory? Or some people would even use the word lenient, right? We're going to look at a group that were very much against that being done. The other group, guys, would say, well, if you're too lenient, right, which would be more of the punishment side, then you're not really forcing a required change, right? Because guys, remember, society in the South and in the North to an extent as well is definitely going to go through a period of change. Okay. So when we're looking at Reconstruction at the federal level, one thing, guys, to maybe pause your screen and take a note, take these things down as we discuss them. Okay, is that you're going to see Reconstruction really kind of put into two categories. One is going to be presidential. The other one we'll look at in a second is going to be what we call congressional, also known to a lot of people as quote unquote radical Reconstruction. Okay, now these two presidents are not the only two during Reconstruction, but they're two of the three. Okay. And I like to tell students, a lot of you guys are looking at the picture of Lincoln and you're thinking probably, man, that's a Photoshop picture. That's true, right? That's not really Lincoln's mohawk and his, cool shades or whatever. Okay. But anyway, kind of a fun picture to think about, guys, how much stress Lincoln's been under, not just during this 4-year conflict approximately, but with creating a plan to be able to try to put the nation back together. And guys, I had a professor of mine in college that used to tell us all the time as teachers and as life people in general, that if we fail to plan, we plan to fail, right? So you have to have a way to go about doing something, but also it's the execution. In other words, the follow through or the carrying out. Okay. So Lincoln in 1863, 1864 is starting to look ahead. The war is going quite a bit better by the latter part of 1863 and 1864. He's not reelected until 1864, but he starts to kind of put together a plan that many historians call the Lincoln's 10% plan. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys are wondering, okay, well, why does the number 10% come into it? Okay. Well, literally, that is pretty much what we're talking about. So if you go back to the previous election, when is the last time that all of these 11 former Confederate states have all voted in a presidential election for a federal U.S. position? And it's going to be in 1860. Okay. Who was also elected to the presidency in 1860? It's going to be Lincoln. Okay. So Lincoln is thinking, in his view, unity, more togetherness, a quick reentry is going to be best for the nation. Okay. And so what does he do? He says, all right, here's the deal. If you were a voter pretty much in the election of 1860, okay, so we're mostly talking about Caucasian men, okay, then if 10% of them would take an oath of allegiance to the Union. Now the question is, guys, what is meant by an oath of allegiance? Well, basically you're saying we're going to favorably reenter. Now, my question, guys, to all of you is, do you see any particular problem with this particular situation, right? Because, guys, last time I checked, if you're doing basic math, it's only about 1 out of every 10 people, all right? That's nowhere close to a 50% majority. And if you're Lincoln, that's acceptable, right? Because you want a quick reentry. You don't want these states to feel like they have to pay the price for what they've done, forgiveness, whatever word. That is not going to be the perspective of the Congress. We'll come back to that. Okay. He's also going to say that you are going to be required to accept and also ratify the 13th Amendment. Okay. The 13th Amendment, if you didn't know this, guys, is the first of 3 Freedmen Amendments. You have to abolish slavery as a part of reentering the country. Okay. So a lot of students say, okay, well, what happens if these states don't reenter? That's a kind of an important question. Most likely, they're going to be under military control, which is in fact going to happen. Okay. Lincoln is going to pass the torch, not because he wanted to, because of his untimely death, to the gentleman that you see in the picture under him, and that is Andrew Johnson. Not Jackson, but Andrew Johnson. An interesting story about Johnson. Johnson was actually a Southerner. He was from the great state of Tennessee. Okay. And a lot of students are asked the question, they're like, well, why in the world does he become vice president then, and then later on the president? The answer is he's not really pro-secession. Okay. So Lincoln is like, okay, this might be a really good idea to be able to obviously re-enter the country, be in a position where we can actually try to, get at least an interest there. This is not going to bode well moving forward. Okay, with obviously all these different people that are going to be opposite of Lincoln. And guys, if you look at Johnson's plan, we're not going to say a lot about it, but just one quick detail. It's not that much different than Lincoln's. Okay. He's going to be, still requiring them to abolish slavery. Okay, you fought this war, you're responsible for the debt that's associated with it. Okay, all this paper money that you printed that now obviously has to, obviously be considered. Inflation is bad, guys. Remember the story I told you all last week when inflation got so high that a basic loaf of bread in some places like $20. That is not inflated to 2020 currency. That is back then, according to that estimate. Okay. Not exactly something that everybody was real happy about. Okay. So I want you all guys to stop or pause your screen and write these questions down. And the reason being is because you're actually going to be using the next slide to actually work through these, and we're going to work through these together. So pause, and when you're actually ready to kind of move forward with the slide, then unpause. Okay. So the question is, guys, the big picture here, how do we compare and mostly contrast presidential and also radical or congressional Reconstruction? Now, keep in mind, when you're talking about presidents, you're talking about Lincoln, you're talking about Johnson, and eventually you're going to be talking about Ulysses S. Grant. Yes, one of the heroes of the war is going to become a president the last 8 years of Reconstruction. Okay, so most of it actually. Okay, so take a look at what's going on with the presidency. Again, we're not going to say a lot about this. Lincoln is obviously making it very clear that a quick reentry and restoration to the Union is going to be in the country's best interest. Now, the question I want to pose to you guys is this. Do you agree with him? Does that position have more pros or cons? Right? The reason I ask you all to think about that, guys, is because the radicals, as you can see here, mostly Republicans, as you can see, okay, they're going to be like, no, this doesn't work for us. That 10% plan is not acceptable, right? It is not cool, right? Good, acceptable, whatever word you want to use, to actually make only 10% of a population that has been gone for 4 years agree to an oath of allegiance. There has to be a more clear majority. And guys, look at where I have my cursor. That's exactly what the Wade Davis bill is going to actually advocate. The two guys don't worry too much about, but they were two congressmen. And what does their basic plan say? You have to have a 50% or more majority, right? So that's quite a bit different, guys. 1 out of every 2 rather than 1 out of every 10. Now, my question to you all, guys, is do you think that's a better system than Lincoln and also Johnson's? Okay, because it's going to take longer. People, guys, are probably not going to be as likely to vote quickly and decisively to be able to re-enter. Not exactly something to keep in mind. But think about this last thing with congressional Reconstruction that I think is absolutely vital. What is the big picture goal of radicals? Well, that's kind of a loaded question. Is the big picture goal to punish? There's a school of historical thinking that would say, yep, that's what they're trying to do. But I guarantee you this, if you had Benjamin Wade here or somebody like Thaddeus Stevens or somebody along those lines, they would disagree. They would say, no, we're not trying to punish. But what are they trying to do, guys? Take a look here. All those people that were former slaves, figuring out a way to actually transition them back to a point of being able to function within the country itself, being able to function socially, economically, and politically. In other words, guys, the word that we use here is actually very important. Trying to establish a degree of full citizenship. Okay. Guys, you have to remember, it has already been determined by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857 that African Americans are not citizens. All right. So if you're going to try to establish a degree of citizenship and full citizenship, you're going to have to clarify that. It's not good enough, according to these people, just to simply abolish slavery. You have to be able to define citizenship, and then even going a step further, you have to be able to say, okay, they have to be able to vote. Okay. Now, they do have a plan here that benefits them. You got to remember, pre-Civil War, what is the dominant political party in the southern states? It is the Democratic Party. Okay. So they are basically looking at this as, you know what? When these states re-enter the Union, okay, remember, we no longer have that 3/5 compromise that basically said that slaves are 3/5 of a person with population representation. They're now all worth 1. And I know for a lot of people that's kind of a difficult concept, but it's really important to keep in mind. Okay. So therefore, what we notice is that you're going to have a lot of push by these radicals for these states to change a lot of their tune, okay, when it came to the idea of this. The question to ask yourself, is it successful then, and also even maybe moving forward into the 1900s or the 20th century, and even maybe to an extent the modern day? That's a loaded question that you'll study later, but it's something to definitely keep in mind. Okay. So what do these radicals do? Well, first of all, guys, remember, like any movement, they're going to be focused on leadership. Okay. Thaddeus Stevens is where you see my cursor right now. This is Charles Sumner. Now, guys, Charles Sumner is not a new face or name. If you remember back in the 1850s, he's the person who actually was attacked, literally, no lie, by Preston Brooks. He's still around. And as you can imagine, you know, being somebody that actually has massive headaches the rest of his life because of that beatdown, he is not going to be like, hey, here's a hug, come back into the Union. No. All right. He's going to be very bitter. I'm not saying he's right on that, but nonetheless, it's important. Now, what do they say? All right, you got to accept some new amendments. You got to abolish slavery. You got to accept the 14th Amendment, which is basically additional due process and also citizenship. And eventually they also say you got to accept the 15th Amendment, which is going to extend suffrage to basically minority men. Now think about why that's significant, guys. A lot of people do not agree with only extending it to men, and you can figure out who I'm talking about. Those are going to be people like Susan B. Anthony, people like Lucretia Mott. Okay, the list goes on and on. So as you can imagine, that's going to create a sizable debate and also division, okay, between people like Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. Douglass, guys, keep in mind, we'll look at him a little bit more as we transition to our next time. Douglass is definitely going to be a name that we continue to see 30 years after the Civil War. He died, in 1895. Okay. So his leadership is going to endure beyond just what he's been doing before and also during the Civil War. Okay. So what do these congressional radicals say? They're like, okay, accept that or don't re-enter. And they also say, we got to figure out a way to transition these freedmen. Guys, remember, what's the definition of freedmen? It's basically the former slaves that are now being transitioned into society as free people, right? Okay. So they're going to say, all right, we need an organization to be able to do it. And that's going to be the Freedmen's Bureau. All right. And a lot of you guys might be wondering, okay, how do they want to go about transitioning them into society? And the answer is basically by helping to educate them. Okay. That's a big thing that they try to do, somewhat successfully, somewhat not. Okay. They're also going to have a plan to try to help them out with things like healthcare, finding, homes, in other words, shelter. And guys, remember, these are people that probably have the clothes on their back. These are people that, some of them may have made a little bit of money working outside of the required hours, but most of them guys are pretty much illiterate. They don't have a lot of, goods and things. It's going to be a very difficult transition. Okay. So that's something to keep in the front of our minds. Okay. Is freedom an easy thing to transition people to if in fact they have not had access to that prior to them? Okay. And you are going to see some civil rights acts that are attempted but not really made successful. And then also, guys, this one act here that's important to write down if you already haven't, and that's going to be the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Okay. A lot of people are like, okay, Mr. Baker, what in the world does that act do? Well, take a moment, guys, to maybe pause your screen here and ask yourself, what does this map actually show us of these states? Now, keep in mind, all of these states that you see that are in the yellow, or in this case, the red, are former Confederate states. Okay. So all 11 of them. Okay. So what the Reconstruction Act of 1867 ended up doing was, imagine guys living in, like I live in North Carolina now. That's where I hang my hats. A lot of you guys might know that if you're my students. Imagine guys walking out of your home or maybe walking into your nearby town or city or whatever, and you would literally see military people walking in the streets with weapons and guns and things. Okay. Now, a lot of people are like, well, why would they do that? The argument is, if you're a radical, is that they're trying to help transition, to, this reentry, and therefore this military rule is essential and also necessary. Okay. But guys, I want you to challenge yourself as a student. Ask yourself the question, okay, why would that also be seen by a lot of people to be a problem? Okay. And I don't know about all of you, but, I'm not really comfortable with having, major weapons and things like that, directed at me. And I'm not saying that to be political, guys, but the reality is that people are not real comfortable with that, but that is the reality. This act, by the way, just a quick note before we continue this next time for a few minutes, is actually going to be in effect for 10 years. In fact, the argument is, guys, when Reconstruction ends in 1877, that it's the Reconstruction Act basically being repealed or basically phased out, that it's considered to be one of the last parts of ending Reconstruction. Okay. Now, I want you all to think, all right? You've got these Northern Republicans that are mostly radicals. Lincoln has since died. I think it would be really interesting to ask ourselves, if Lincoln lives, does Reconstruction look a little bit different under his watch? And we're probably never going to know the answer to that. But the reality is, guys, Lincoln does not, right? He died. His VP, who, by the way, was a Democrat from Tennessee, like we said, Johnson, takes over. He is going to lock horns a lot with these radical Republicans. Okay. And a lot of you guys are like, well, what can he do? Well, one thing that he can do, even though he knows that this group of senators and House reps that are radicals can overturn any of his vetoes, he can use veto power to be kind of like an Achilles heel or a thorn in the side. Okay. And that's exactly what he did. So, guys, a lot of these acts that we've been kind of looking at briefly, he's going to do a lot of things like vetoing. Now, is vetoing a constitutional thing that the president has the right to do? Yes. It's not new. Jackson used it a lot, more so than the previous presidents before him. Lincoln, I'm sure, had some vetoes, et cetera. So it's not a new thing. Washington, I think, had 2 that he used in his 8 years in office. But guys, the problem is that these radicals are going to see Andrew Johnson as basically an Achilles heel. Okay. And the question is, what do I mean when I say that? Well, somebody who's kind of in the way that's keeping them from progressing. Okay. So everything that they want to do to try to move the freedom of the freedmen further along, he's basically interfering with. What can they do? We're almost finished. Well, first of all, you're welcome to pause the slide here if you need to. But we're going to talk mostly in this particular slide about his impeachment. Okay. All right. So if you finished up your writing this down, guys, the question is, guys, why is there a rivalry? Because you've got two different sets of interests that are thinking very differently about the issue of Reconstruction. Okay. And so put yourself in the shoes of the radicals. This guy is kind of in the way. You're able to override basically almost everything that he's vetoing. He's a problem, right? If you're looking at it from the standpoint of somebody like Benjamin Wade or Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner. The question is, what can you do to get rid of him? And a lot of you guys might be thinking, well, how about the next election? Well, the next election is 1868. Okay. And so they're going to try to get this ball rolling with impeachment. And so, but they got to figure out, okay, what's a way that we can do it, right? You got to have, the guy has to have had done something wrong. Okay. To be able, I'm sorry, double stand there. But anyway, to be in a position where they can say, okay, you know what? You now need to go. What does Congress do? They pass what became known as the Tenure of Office Act. This act, the quick nuts and bolts, guys, on this is that this act, in a sense, basically said the following. Let's pretend that Mr. Baker's president. Okay. And let's pretend that one of my students, I appoint to be Secretary of State or Treasury or Agriculture or whatever one of the posts was back then. All right, there's been ones added since, but you get the point. Basically, what the Tenure of Office Act, in a sense, stated was that if I'm going to dismiss one of those positions, that I have to basically go to the Congress, or in this case, the Senate first. Now, a lot of you guys might be wondering, why do I need to go to the Senate? And the reasoning is, guys, is because according to our Constitution, the president appoints these cabinet members and the Senate confirms them or approves them. Okay, so that's the reason why the Senate is pretty important. So that's the deal. They passed this act, I believe it was over his veto. Okay, and so the question is, all right, how are we going to get this guy to violate it and fall on his sword? Okay, and the answer is they find somebody to actually kind of do their dirty work. Right, so they go up to this gentleman who was the Secretary of Warfare. Edwin M. Stanton was his name. The main name might not be important, but the idea, guys, is, and they're probably having a conversation. I can just imagine being a fly on the wall. Hey, do you like Johnson? Probably not. Help us get rid of this guy. Okay, cool. What do I need to do? Right, and they probably promised him some political concessions or whatever. So basically, what he's got to do is he's got to get Johnson to eventually fire him. So there's one thing that Andrew Johnson and Andrew Jackson had in common. That was a pretty sharp fuse or temper. So imagine Stanton constantly saying things in meetings, doing things behind the scenes to make him mad. And eventually one day, Johnson cracks. What does that mean? He basically does what he's not supposed to. And he says, you know what? You're fired. But there's a problem here. He doesn't go to the Senate before he does it. Now, technically, my question, guys, to all of you is, has Johnson violated an act? And the answer is yes. But according to our Constitution, Article 2, Section 4, there's 4 reasons why a president should be impeached. Okay? Treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. Okay? The question to kind of consider here, guys, is Has he done any of those four things that would require him to be impeached? Now, the reality is, guys, he does become the first president of three now to be impeached. All right. The other two being President Clinton in the 90s and the other one being President Trump just a little less than a year ago. Okay. However, it's an interesting story. So he does get impeached by the House. But one thing to keep in mind is that when you're impeached, the first phase of it at the House, you are formally being accused. So what does that mean? It means that they found enough evidence against you to follow through with kind of like a trial. Okay. And according to our Constitution, which body represents the trial phase? It's the Senate. Okay. And guys, from what I understand, it came down to one vote. And oh yeah, by the way, to be able to remove, which is what the Senate's deciding on, you got to have a 2/3 vote. So today that would be 100 senators, so 67 out of 100. Okay, so that's a much larger number than simply accusing, which is half of the House, plus one. Okay. And for what I understand, it came down to, I believe it was a gentleman from Kansas by the name, of Edmund G. Ross. And Edmund G. Ross, guys, from what I understand, was approached. The Republicans are trying to figure out, do they have enough support? Like if you've ever heard of the concept of leaders in the Congress and whips and people that are going around to try to figure out how their parties are going to vote and everything to see if they have enough support for certain things. Well, this guy is the vote that if he votes yes, Johnson is basically going to be out of office. And if he votes no, then Johnson stays. No pressure. And so evidently they called his name or whatever, and in a very confident voice, he says not guilty. That's the one vote that kept Andrew Johnson from being able to be removed from office. Okay. Now, why do I bring that up? I have a question for all of you to think about before we wrap this up. Why would somebody like Ross do that? Knowing that his party is obviously very adamant about this. And I have theories on it, and that's not for me, guys, to really point out too much here. But a lot of commentary seems to suggest, commentary meaning historians that write about this for a living and everything, that it seems that there may have been him trying to protect the office to an extent, right? I don't know if that's 100% true and everybody's thinking, but what would it have looked like had, these people kind of set him up in a sense to fall on his sword and therefore he gets removed from office? Okay. Anyway, something for you to ponder and think about. Okay. What other political changes do we notice? Well, the South is not going to be successful with the Republicans trying to establish the longer term Republican parties that dominate Southern politics for the time being. Okay. So what we notice, guys, is that as a result, you notice this, guys, on my screen. There's a concept that might be worth noting if you already haven't. It's called the Solid South concept, which is a fancy way of saying that the former Confederate states are going to revert back to the Democratic Party really dominating a lot of the politics. Okay, so that could be they're electing more Democratic people that are going to serve in state governments, local governments, and also, of course, federal governments. Okay, and guys, you got to remember the population numbers because of the slave population having full representation. Okay, or population, excuse me. There's going to be more electoral votes in these former Confederate states. Therefore, they're going to have arguably even a greater amount of political power than even before the Civil War in that respect. Okay. Here's another thing to keep in mind when you're talking, guys, about the freedmen and this is kind of what I want to introduce before next time we'll further develop this, guys. You see a lot of resistance, okay, to a lot of these different things that a lot of these radicals are trying to do, these policies, right? These, new amendments, these new civil rights acts, these, the Freedmen's Bureau are going to be seen by some people as quote unquote meddling or a meddling organization that is stirring up trouble. Okay. And so what do we notice? You're going to see, guys, the presence of things like segregation. Jim Crow laws are pretty much, guys, those kind of laws that are going to make segregation basically legal, right? So that's the kind of thing, if you're familiar with like the separate schools, the separate, restrooms, restaurants, things like that. Okay. Which brings me to my last thing, and that is Frederick Douglass on Reconstruction. Okay. Now, if you're in my honors class, you're going to do a discussion board on this after you've actually done your weekly reading. Okay. So we're going to introduce this, and then, we'll pick this back up next time as we kind of try to do a little bit more. Okay. But guys, put yourself in Frederick Douglass's shoes. Okay. You've been waiting pretty much your entire life prior to the 13th Amendment for slavery to be abolished. Okay. But the argument is that it took a civil war to do it. Okay. So look at what Douglass said. I want to say this was in the 1870s, but it's important to keep in mind. Look at what he said. Slavery, quote, has been called a great many names, and it will call itself by yet another name. And you and I and all of us had better wait and see in what new skin this old snake will come forth next. Okay. I want to leave you today with a challenge to maybe reflect on that quote and ask yourself the question, what do you think Douglass, guys, is getting at there? Is he being too pessimistic regarding, how the country ended the institution of slavery and how, this is going to move the country forward beyond this time period? Okay. And we'll pick that up next time. As always, it's Mr. Baker. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to be able to instruct you on some things. Guys, one quick thing, keep in mind, historians write about this for their livelihood. If you want to read a really good book on Reconstruction, keep in mind it's an interpretation, so you can agree and disagree with it. But Eric Foner wrote a great book called Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution. And it's an interesting book because, he really unpacks, in probably 800 or 900 pages of detail, every element of Reconstruction, from the amendments to, the Freedmen's Bureau to the presidential side of it. And, so I would encourage you, if you're interested, to maybe read further if you want to. But as always, feel free to email me, bakerd@franklinacademy.org, and I will see you next time where we pick up with this quote and we continue to look at the effects of Reconstruction on the country as well as the freedmen. Thank you. Take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.